Nolan Grayson spent 20 years on Earth pretending to be a hero, and the whole thing still almost worked. He built a life, raised a son, became the most trusted person on the planet, and by the time he finally moved on, the Guardians of the Globe. Nobody saw it coming. That was the plan. Slow, patient, invisible. The Viltrumite Empire sent the right person for that job. But what if they hadn't? What if instead of Nolan, they sent Thragg? Everything changes, and almost none of it is good for Earth. Before we get into it, you need to understand why this question matters. The entire first season of Invincible, and really the entire first arc of the show, is built on a specific version of how Viltrumite conquest works post-Scourge virus. Before the virus, Viltrumites just showed up and took planets by force. After it cut their population down to fewer than 50, that approach stopped being practical. You can't send an army when you don't have one. So the Empire shifted strategy. They started using their one real advantage, which is that Viltrumites live for thousands of years and barely age. One Viltrumite could spend decades on a planet, become its greatest protector, earn the population's complete trust, and then dismantle every defense from the inside before the takeover. No resistance, no warning, just collapse. That was Nolan's mission on Earth. He arrived in the 1980s, befriended Cecil Stedman, became Omni-Man, married Debbie, and spent 20 years making Earth love him. By the time the show begins, he's the most powerful hero on the planet, and the last person anyone would ever suspect of being its enemy. Thragg would never do any of that, not because he can't. Thragg is every bit as intelligent as Nolan. He led the entire Viltrum Empire for thousands of years. He outmaneuvered the coalition of planets for most of the Viltrumite War while operating with fewer than 50 soldiers against a galaxy-wide alliance. He kept a spy inside the coalition for years without anyone finding out. He's one of the best strategic minds in the known universe, but strategy for Thragg has always been in service of power. He doesn't pretend. He doesn't build relationships. He doesn't value the idea of making something work slowly when he could make it work immediately through force. The distinction matters more than it might seem. Nolan's infiltration worked because it wasn't only a disguise, it became how he lived. He became part of Earth. He wasn't performing humanity from a distance, he was living it, eating with his family, watching Mark grow up, and having conversations with Cecil that weren't purely tactical. When other Viltrumites showed up on Earth later, like Anissa, the contrast is obvious immediately. Anissa is good at performing warmth when she needs to, she uses it strategically, but the people around her, Mark especially, can feel that something's off. They can't always name it, but it's there. Thragg wouldn't even manage Anissa's level of performance. His whole identity is built around not having to hide what he is. He's the strongest Viltrumite. He's the Grand Regent. Everyone around him in his actual life is either afraid of him or serving him. The specific skill of making people feel safe around you, of making them like and trust you, isn't something you develop when fear has always been enough. The infiltration approach was developed after the Scourge virus because the Empire had no other choice. Thragg accepted it as a necessity, but it was never who he was. He was trained from birth to be the strongest Viltrumite, the one whose job it is to fight the fights everyone else loses, and that shaped everything about how he sees the world, so picture it. The year is somewhere in the 1980s, because instead of Nolan, Thragg lands on Earth. He doesn't find Cecil Stedman, he doesn't get a secret identity, he doesn't put on a costume and pretend to save people while building a cover story. He lands probably somewhere densely populated just to make the message clear immediately, and he tells everyone exactly who he is and what he's there for. Earth is being absorbed into the Viltrum Empire. Its people will serve the Empire or they'll be cleared out. That's the offer. Think about what Earth's response looks like in that case. The show tells us what the GDA and the world's heroes can do when they know a Viltrumite is an enemy from the start, because we see it when Nolan's cover breaks in the season 1 finale. Cecil throws the hammer, their orbital laser weapon. He sends the Reaniman. He deploys the most powerful weapon systems the GDA has. Nolan walks through all of it like it's nothing. And at that point in his development, Nolan is significantly weaker than Thragg. The gap between Nolan and Thragg in the comics is wide enough that when they fight directly during the Viltrumite War, Nolan can barely slow him down. So the GDA throws everything at Thragg and it bounces off. The Guardians of the Globe at full strength, the original 7+, whoever else Earth can put together, engage Thragg simultaneously. Remember what Nolan did to 7 of them in episode 1 in a confined space without breaking a sweat. Now imagine the same fight with someone who is meaningfully stronger, who has been trained from birth specifically for combat rather than for infiltration, and who doesn't have any reason to hold back because there's no mission to protect. The Guardians don't survive. The GDA's arsenal is exhausted inside an afternoon. And here's the part people underestimate. The Guardians in the 1980s aren't even the Guardians we see in season 1. They don't have the decades of development they accumulate before Mark's story begins. The Immortal is there, sure, and War Woman and the others, but they're working with 1980s technology, 1980s communication, 1980s anything. Cecil is there, but the GDA isn't the machine it becomes by the time Nolan's cover breaks in the show. The orbital weapons don't exist yet. The anti-Viltrumite research doesn't exist yet. The inner ear frequency weakness, which the GDA discovers through careful observation over years, hasn't been found yet. They're not just outgunned, they're completely unprepared for what Thragg is. Cecil has never studied Viltrumite biology. The inner ear weakness hasn't been found. Nolan isn't feeding them anything quietly because Nolan isn't there. Thragg lands, the heroes fight back because that's what heroes do, and it's over before anyone can coordinate a real response. The Viltrumite plan, the one designed for subtlety and patience, becomes completely irrelevant because the outcome is the same and it happened in a day instead of 20 years. Winning the fight isn't even the real issue. What matters is what comes after. And Earth's story almost certainly doesn't go anywhere from there. When Nolan's cover blew in season 1, Earth had 3 things going for it. The first was that Mark existed and was already developing. The second was that Nolan's 20 years of human life had changed him in ways he didn't fully understand yet. The third was that even though Nolan destroyed the Guardians and nearly killed Mark, he stopped. Love got in the way. He flew off the planet instead of finishing the job, and that left Earth intact with a defender in place. Thragg shows up on Earth in the 1980s with none of what slowed Nolan down. No Mark, no Debbie, no 2 decades of human life quietly rewriting his priorities. He doesn't stop. There's no emotional break. He's not there to quietly weaken Earth's defenses. He's there to take the planet and add it to the Empire. I get when Resistance breaks down, and it breaks down quickly because Earth's heroes in the 1980s don't have the benefit of 40 years of GDA development or a Viltrumite hybrid teenager in their corner. He locks it down. The planet becomes Viltrumite property. The population survives to the extent that they're useful and compliant. Anyone who keeps fighting gets removed. That's the future Earth ends up with. Mark Grayson never exists, and that's actually the most important consequence here. Nolan's time on Earth produced Mark. Mark is in the show's own framing and in the comics the thing that eventually tips the scale against the Viltrumite Empire. He's the one who defeats Conquest. He's the one who fights alongside the Coalition during the Viltrumite War. He's the one who eventually faces Thragg in the sun and wins. His existence is the single biggest reason the Empire doesn't just roll across Earth and keep going. Take Nolan off Earth in the 1980s and you take Mark out of the story entirely. More than that, you take away the specific version of Mark that the story needs. Mark has Viltrumite genetics, yes, but he also has 20 years of being raised by Debbie Grayson, of going to school with friends, of having a real teenage life that gave his power a reason to exist. Showrunner Simon Ratzioppa has talked about how emotional state unlocks an extra 30 to 40% of what a character can do in a fight. For Mark, that unlocks when the people he loves are in danger. That's not a Viltrumite trait. That's a human one, and it's the thing that Thragg's entire conditioning worked to destroy in himself. Without Nolan on Earth, without Debbie, without 20 years of being raised by someone who showed up, that version of Mark never gets built. Now, you might push back here and say, Thragg could have still had a child on Earth the same way Nolan did. That's true in a technical sense, because the Empire's post-Scourge virus strategy did eventually include Viltrumites breeding with native populations to produce hybrid soldiers. Thragg himself did exactly that on Thraxa after his exile, fathering dozens of rapidly aging half-Viltrumite children as the start of a new army, but that was a long-term play he developed specifically because he had no other option after being removed from power. On Earth in the 1980s, as the Empire's representative, he wouldn't be thinking in those terms. He'd be consolidating control, establishing Viltrumite dominance, and reporting back to the Empire that the job was done. Even if he did have a child on Earth, that child wouldn't be Mark. We know what Thragg's children look like because we see them in the comics. When Thragg settled on Thraxa after his exile, he fathered dozens of half-Viltrumite children with the native population. He trained them into an army. When they were sent into combat against Mark's allies, most of them died. Thragg watched it happen and told Ursal, the daughter who survived and confronted him about the losses, that no sacrifice was too great for the mission, and that the ones who fell were weak and deserved to die. That's what Thragg calls fatherhood. His children are soldiers. When they stop being useful soldiers, they're gone. Mark grew up with a father who was hiding a terrible secret, but who still showed up, who threw a baseball with him, who talked to him about what it meant to be a hero. That presence built something that no amount of training produces by itself. Thragg's children on Earth would be fighters. None of them would be Mark. But let's say we're being generous with that. Let's say Thragg takes a different approach than we'd expect. Maybe the Empire specifically assigns him an infiltration mission the way they assigned Nolan, and Thragg, being the disciplined leader he is, follows the orders even though they go against every instinct he has. In that case, he's on Earth. He's pretending. He gets a cover identity, a civilian life, a job that puts him in proximity to the people who matter. What happens then? The answer is that the infiltration still fails, but it fails differently and probably faster. Nolan's cover held for 20 years because Nolan was genuinely becoming something different. The love he built up was real. When he talked to Mark about heroism or threw a baseball in the backyard or built a life with Debbie, those weren't calculated moves. They were genuine. And the realness of it is what made him convincing, because people can feel the difference between someone who's pretending to care and someone who means it, even when they can't explain why. Thragg caring about humans is something that doesn't happen. He looks down on other species deeply. In the comics, when other Viltrumites on Earth start forming real connections with humans, Craig with his mates, Anissa with her complicated feelings toward Mark, Thragg treats it as a weakness to be managed. He threatens to kill them for it. The idea of him building a real domestic life, attending school events, forming a friendship with Cecil Stedman, having a real marriage, all of it requires him to become someone he fundamentally is not. He could fake it for a while. He couldn't fake it for 20 years. Something would crack. It could be a moment where his patience runs out and he does something that blows the cover. It could be a fight where he has the chance to end things by force and the mission says hold back and he doesn't. Either way, the contempt shows through eventually. Thragg is brilliant, but his intelligence has always been deployed in service of domination. The kind of performance Nolan pulled off, the genuine warmth, the actual investment in human life, that's not something Thragg has, and it's not something he'd ever develop. There's also the specific way way Thragg leads that matters here. When Thragg was Grand Regent, the Viltrumites didn't love him, they feared him. Nolan, for all his hidden agenda, inspired people for real. Heroes wanted to work with him. Cecil trusted him. The public loved him. That wasn't all performance. Some of it was who Nolan really was, a Viltrumite who found himself enjoying the work of protecting people, even when that work was supposed to be a cover. Thragg, leading through fear, is effective in a military hierarchy. It doesn't work in a suburban neighborhood. It doesn't work at a PTA meeting or a team up with the Guardians or a quiet conversation with Cecil over how to handle the next global crisis. The specific kind of social intelligence that Nolan used to maintain his cover for 20 years is not something you can replicate through fear and discipline. It requires a genuine interest in the people around you. Thragg doesn't have that, and the people around him would feel it eventually, even if they couldn't name what was wrong. This is why the version where Thragg does the infiltration mission is, if anything, more dangerous for Earth in the short term than the version where he just arrives openly. An overt Thragg can be fought, even if that fight ends badly. A Thragg running an infiltration that cracks after 8 or 10 years instead of 20 gives Earth no time to build the defenses that the full 20-year timeline would have allowed. The GDA's research into Viltrumite weaknesses, which is almost entirely driven by the years they spend studying Nolan quietly before his cover breaks, never reaches completion. The anti-Viltrumite work that eventually lets Cecil threaten Nolan with a kill switch and lets Robot build effective countermeasures, none of that happens if the cover breaks in year 8. There's another angle to this. What if Thragg came to Earth not in the 1980s, but in the present day, with everything already in place? Mark exists. The GDA has 40 years of development behind it. Cecil knows Viltrumites are real, knows their weaknesses, and has been preparing for this since the moment Nolan's cover broke. Thragg arrives instead of Nolan, or in addition to Nolan, the way Conquest arrived in Season 3. The show gives us a partial answer for this one, because we see what Thragg does when he encounters Earth's defenders at full strength during the Viltrumite War arc. He showed up with the surviving Viltrumites after the war, revealed himself to Mark and Nolan on Earth, and offered terms. He didn't come in swinging immediately. He calculated that Earth's population was more useful as a breeding ground for Viltrumites than as a battlefield, so he proposed the truce. 37 Viltrumites living among humans, rebuilding the race quietly in exchange for leaving Earth's people alone. That is Thragg being patient and strategic. And even in that version, even when he's choosing to talk instead of fight, the whole arrangement is a trap. He's on Earth's moon. He's building towards something. He uses patience when he has to. But it all comes back to the same goal: a Viltrum empire rebuilt and running everything. What makes this version particularly unsettling is that it almost worked. Mark agreed to the truce. Earth got a few years of quiet while Thragg's plan developed underneath it. The whole arrangement holds until Mark is strong enough and informed enough to stop it. Remove Nolan from Earth in the 1980s and that version of Mark doesn't exist. Thragg's long game runs without anyone who can end it, and the power dynamics shift too. Cecil's kill switch works on Nolan in the show because Cecil had 20 years to study Viltrumite biology through Nolan, and because Nolan, for all his strength, has an emotional relationship with Cecil that made him hesitate. Thragg walks into that differently. He doesn't have a relationship with Cecil. He doesn't have an emotional hesitation about anything. The kill switch being implanted near the inner ear relies on having physical access to the Viltrumite in question, which isn't something you're getting with Thragg without his cooperation. And Robot's anti-Viltrumite drones, the ones that produce the frequency from the volcanic titanium alloy, require Thragg to actually hit them. Against Nolan or Conquest, that's a given because they fight aggressively and hit things hard. Against Thragg, who has more combat experience than anyone in the Empire, you'd have to actually land the drones on him first. And Thragg's tactical awareness is operating at a level that makes that very hard to pull off. The GDA's arsenal in the present day is better than it was in the 1980s, but Thragg is better than Nolan. The gap between what Cecil has and what Thragg is still closes badly for Earth's side. The anti-Viltrumite tools were built around studying Nolan and Mark. Thragg sits above both of them in the power ranking. The tools that inconvenience Nolan might not reach Thragg at all. there's also what Thragg's presence would have done to the Coalition of Planets. In the actual show and comics, the Coalition exists partly because Nolan eventually came over to their side. He became one of their most powerful members, like he helped them find weapons. He recruited allies like Space Racer. His insider knowledge of the Viltrum Empire gave the Coalition information it couldn't have gotten any other way. That whole thread, which is what eventually makes the Viltrumite War winnable, exists because the Empire sent someone who was capable of defecting. Thragg doesn't defect. Thragg has never defected. When he was deposed as Grand Regent, after other Viltrumites found out he'd hidden Mark's royal bloodline to protect his own position, he didn't surrender or change his beliefs or join anyone's side. He took himself to Thraxa, built an army from scratch, and came back. He's not someone who wakes up one day and decides the Empire was wrong. The belief in Viltrum isn't something sitting on top of who he is. That's who he is. So with Thragg on Earth instead of Nolan, the Coalition gets nothing from the inside. No defector. No one who knows where the weaknesses are. The Coalition still exists, still knows Viltrumites are a threat, but they're working with much less. You know, the Scourge virus plan still exists as an option, but deploying it requires getting close to Thragg, and getting close to Thragg is the part that costs you everything. There's also Alan the alien to think about. In the show, Alan's role shifts fundamentally when he meets Mark, who tells him there's already a Viltrumite on Earth and the situation is complicated. That conversation doesn't happen without Mark. Alan still flies his patrol routes. He still gets into his regular fights with whoever Earth's designated protector is, which is now Thragg. That fight lasts about as long as you'd expect. Alan, at his early power level, is not capable of handling Thragg. He loses badly if he survives at all, and the information about what's happening on Earth never gets to Thetis and the Coalition in the form it needs to. The chain that eventually leads to the Coalition gathering the Scourge virus, recruiting Space Racer, and building the alliance that fights the Viltrumite War runs through a specific set of events, and most of those events require Nolan to exist as someone who changed sides. Without that, the Coalition is making moves in the dark against an empire that has one of its best soldiers on a key planet. They're guessing, and they're guessing wrong. The Viltrumite War doesn't end with the Coalition winning. It ends with the Coalition being destroyed, or with a deal where the Empire holds all the cards. Thetis might still try to release the Scourge virus as a last resort, but deploying it against Thragg while Earth is firmly under Viltrumite control is a different calculation than deploying it against a weakened empire during an active war. The Coalition loses its best opportunity the moment Nolan never turns on the Empire. The Viltrumite infiltration strategy worked on Earth specifically because Nolan was the wrong person for the job in the right way. He was too good at being human, he cared too much. His failure wasn't a flaw in the plan, it was a flaw in the soldier, and that flaw saved the planet. Thragg would have been the right person for a completely different version of the plan, the one where the Empire still had the numbers to take planets by force. The Scourge virus took that off the table. What it left behind required something Thragg simply doesn't have, the ability to want the life he was pretending to live. They got lucky, they sent Nolan, they just didn't know it. And the Empire, for all its thousands of years of conquest across the galaxy, never figured out that the thing most likely to bring it down wasn't a weapon or a virus or a coalition of planets. It was a soldier who spent 20 years on a small planet and forgot to stay cold. Thragg arrives in season 4 as the final boss specifically because he's what the Viltrumite Empire really looks like underneath Nolan's cover story. The real thing. No 20 years of human life softening the edges. Nolan spent 20 years learning that ideology was wrong. Thragg will die still believing it was right. That's the distance between them. That's why one broke and the other never did. Nolan still killed the Guardians. He still nearly killed his own son in a field in Chicago. None of that was clean or easy, but the moment he stopped, the moment he looked at Mark's face in the dirt and couldn't bring himself to finish, that was the crack the Empire never saw coming, the flaw they never planned for. Thragg doesn't have that crack. Battle Beast fought him for days in the comics and Thragg walked out. He fought Mark inside a star with both of them stripped to muscle and bone by the heat, and he kept going. There's no Chicago moment for Thragg, no broken pause, no love getting in the way. Thragg was only ever a weapon. That's why he would have won. That's also why the story would have been over. Nolan built a relationship, and the relationship beat the Empire. If you watch this far, consider leaving a like and remember to subscribe for more deep dives into the Invincible universe every week.